For many riders and motorcycle enthusiasts, the sport bike is the pinnacle of motorcycle expression. The pursuit of speed, performance, and unparalleled handling at the expense of comfort, practicality, and basically anything else is of no concern to the sport bike purist. For decades, a manufacturer's racing program was fundamental to their success in selling street bikes. Innovations in racing led to innovations in the production bikes, many of them homologated for racing use. That meant the enthusiast was buying basically top-shelf stuff. There was a time you could buy a two-stroke MotoGP race replica on the showroom floors, or as close to it as possible. But things have really changed, and sport bikes then have very little in common with sport bikes now. Sport bikes have advanced well beyond the point of any practical use for a civilian rider. Diminishing purchase power and the ever-fleeting value of the dollar has led to consumers searching for more value and practicality. It's a little tough to justify a $25,000 Ducati when your wages keep going down relative year over year. The framework of the modern sport bike is changing before our very eyes. No longer are they selling homologated, uncompromising race replicas, but instead using technology from top-shelf racing to trickle down into more normal motorcycles that more people can ride. We're seeing this huge change with the Yamaha R9, new Ducati V2. We're seeing motorcycles that are practical, usable, and fun. But let's talk about how they used to be in the past and what we're going to now. Before top-shelf sport bikes were aerodynamic engineering marvels, the bikes that people used to go racing were basically the same bikes that they sold on showroom floors. The earliest sanctioned races, like the Isle of Man TT, was a great proving ground for brands like Norton, Triumph, MV Agusta to showcase what their bikes could do. By the mid-20th century, as racing grew in popularity, manufacturers started exploring more specialized machines. And you gotta keep in mind, back in the day, the gains that people were making were crazy. I mean, they didn't even know to use a one-piece leather suit until one guy tried it and won a race by like 10 seconds because he was literally more aerodynamic. We're talking about crazy gains back in the day. Famous brands with amazing racing heritage like Norton and Triumph used their parallel twin cafe racer styled bikes to go racing, making specialized versions of them in the 60s and 70s. But if you look at those machines versus their road-going counterparts, they look pretty darn similar. But those manufacturers started thinking about things like more rigid frames and different center of gravities and shorter wheelbases, really coming up with the formula we've seen today as the modern sport bike. After World War II, Japan definitely had something to say about becoming a major motorcycling world power. I mean, all those engineers that were building Japanese planes had to go do something, right? So they went and built heavy industries and motorcycles. Turns out they're pretty good at doing that. Soichiro Honda specifically was determined to beat the Europeans at their own game, and Honda developed one of the coolest race bikes of all time. The RC166 was a 250cc inline six that could rev to over 20,000 RPM and is still one of the most haunting sounds in motorcycling. Take a quick listen. The success of Honda's racing motorcycles led directly to the development of their road bikes. This started the trend of developing race bikes for prototype-style racing that then you could take some of the tech to apply to the road bikes and not the other way around as the Europeans were doing, building pretty competent road bikes to go racing. The CB450 was their first attempt to take down the big bikes that Triumph and Harley-Davidson had at the time, but it didn't really stick, and then the CB750 was launched, and we all know what happened after that. The CB750 truly can be coined as the first superbike. It featured a transverse-mounted inline four-cylinder engine with overhead cams, and the architecture of this machine truly set the tone for all future sport bikes. Kawasaki followed suit with the Z1, and it only further cemented that inline four machines were certainly the way that sport bikes were going to go. Well, at least four cylinders anyways, as we all know what's going to happen with the V4 bikes later in this video. Alright, then in the mid-70s, something really interesting happened in that two strokes started eclipsing four strokes just because of the way the regulations were set up back in the day. In Grand Prix racing, you had 125, 350, and 500cc categories back in the day, and the only requirement was that your bike had to be 500cc's of displacement. Manufacturers quickly realized that if the only rule was that it had to be 500cc's, well, a two-stroke was the way to go, because in a two-stroke you have twice as many power pulses per cycle as you do in a four-stroke, meaning it makes roughly twice as much horsepower per displacement cube. That's certainly an oversimplification, so don't crucify me for it in the comments. Suzuki competed in Grand Prix racing with the Square 4 two-stroke RG500, a very interesting engine layout and a very interesting motorcycle. Yamaha famously sold versions of their TZ350 and TZ500 motorcycles as well, and Yamaha famously raced the YZR500 and the TZ350 too. With peaky power bands, crazy top-end abilities, these bikes had insane power-to-weight ratios, but they didn't have frames or brakes to match, so they were kind of death traps to ride. That's why you see a lot of old-school racers from the late 80s riding their bike in a bit of a crossed-up way because you never knew when that thing was going to high side. But something really interesting started happening in the 80s in relation to two-stroke machine and four-stroke machine and what consumers were getting at the showroom floor. So by the 80s, two-strokes weren't allowed to be sold in the US anymore, and slowly but surely, the Superbike series started getting more popular than actual Grand Prix racing because people could buy bikes that were closer to that. Grand Prix racing with their two-strokes machines started to just get kind of weird for people. They were like, well, I can't even get a two-stroke anymore, and I know that's the most racy bike, but it's not relevant to me. So in the 80s, you had mismatches of bikes like the Suzuki RG250, which was a 250cc two-stroke machine, but you also had bikes like the GSX R750. And all these bikes were early pioneers in what was going to be what we know as the modern sport bike. Now in the 1990s, sport bikes were front and center. They were absolutely the most popular category of motorcycle available. And manufacturers were making serious strides with improvements in lower weight, better frames, better handling, more powerful engines. It was a really exciting time. For example, in 1992, Honda released the CBR 900RR Fireblade, which was an absolute lightning bolt in the industry. It was only 4 pounds heavier than the CBR 600 and nearly 80 pounds lighter than its next competitor in its category. Now, in the mid-90s, like I said, World Superbike was in full swing, and it was starting to eclipse MotoGP because two-strokes just weren't that popular anymore and couldn't be sold. Honda had success early on in the series with the VFR 750, but by the mid-90s, Ducati was cleaning up shop with the Ducati 916, which is arguably one of the most beautiful and influential sport bikes ever made. Those of you who watched it back in the day might remember Carl Fogarty as the domineering force on the Ducati 916. I was too young to watch it back then, so I can only look at highlight reels. The 90-degree 916cc L-twin Desmo motor found in the Ducati had a broad spread of torque and was super good at racing. In this particular configuration, that proved better than the peaky inline fours that the other manufacturers were using. It had a chromoly trellis frame, single-sided swing arm, undertail exhaust pipe, and just some of the most drop-dead sexy looks I've ever seen on a motorcycle. And the 916 wasn't an outlier for Ducati. They then went with the 996 and the 998. And honestly, they saw a bunch of success with the 999, even though people think that one is a little bit ugly. The influence of this machine cannot be understated, and you can see it all the way into modern Italian motorcycles like MV Agustas and the new Panigale V2. Now, of course, one way we've made huge strides is the fact that motorcycles are just more advanced than they ever were. I think about the Yamaha CP2 found in the MT-07, a tried and true platform that makes pretty much perfect amounts of power for almost anything you want to do. They stick that engine in an adventure bike, a naked bike, or even a sport bike, and guess what? I've got a giveaway MT-07 featuring that motor on yammynoob.co. Become a member today, support the show, give back to the channel that gives you so much motorcycling content. We're one of the largest independent motorcycle media channels on YouTube. If you don't want to do that, you can pick up a hat, a t-shirt, a hoodie. That's a great way to support too, and every dollar you spend will be an entry to win, subject to a multiplier. Get ready to win the Yamaha MT-07 by heading over to yammynoob.co. We're giving away a new bike every month this riding season, so don't miss it. In the modern era, things have been changing. In the last 15 years, there's been no shortage of performance gains on motorcycles, albeit marginal at best. top shelf superbikes are all making over 200 horsepower now. We have advanced fueling, variable intake systems, variable valve timing. I mean, the list goes on and on. Advanced IMU, 6-axis controls. I mean, it's crazy. All these advancements came from racing, and we realized we could make safer street bikes through them too. But despite sport bikes being the best that they've ever been, their popularity is waning. With all the advanced tech, performance features, and rider aids, the cost has unfortunately gone up for these bikes. Many riders just want something cheaper, simpler, and more practical. For a long time, you had sort of UJM or cruisers and sport bikes. So if you wanted a motorcycle that had real performance chops, you had to go with the sport bike, but that's really not the case nowadays. Motorcycles across the board are powerful now. We don't think of them. I mean, the new Ducati V2 came out and has 120 horsepower, and people are saying it's the slowest thing ever. I can't believe it's so slow. But that's literally the amount of power that a 916 made. It's not slow. And what's interesting is there's, of course, the new brand of hyper naked bikes that have just as much power as an old school superbike, but more approachable ergonomics and just a better frame design for street use. There's muscle cruisers that are fast, and hell, even some adventure bikes are pretty darn fast. There's just a whole lot more variance for riders who want the ability to go a little bit quick, but also do something else too. Top shelf performance and high horsepower is no longer limited to just sport bikes, is what I'm saying. And the naked variants that were sold 20 years ago were extremely watered down versions of sport bikes, whereas now they're highly cross-platform with the exact same engine as their other sport bike counterparts. You think about an R9 and an MT-09, it's the same engine. And for those who want fully fared bikes, we're now seeing a resurgence of an old school style of motorcycle. You have things like the R7, the GSX 8R, even the Aprilia RS660 to an extent, that's affordable, fun, approachable, and provides a lot of value, but isn't quite as committed as an old school superbike. Tightening emissions regulations are obviously not doing sport bikes any favors either. It's harder and harder to sell these bikes that make a bunch of hydrocarbons out the tailpipe and have multi-cylinders. It's why we're seeing big parallel twins. So flagship sport bikes are sort of naturally being pushed into this flagship halo bike territory where you regularly see them sell for $25,000, $30,000, even $40,000 if you go to the Ducati dealership. So sport bikes then versus now, what can we make of this? It can be tempting to look back in the history books and think, wow, sport bikes were so amazing back in the day. Things are so much worse now. The bikes used to make more power. They were more raw, more analog, and you could get them a dime a dozen. And honestly, old head sport bike riders and low IQ sport bike simps on Instagram keep commenting things like the R6 being better than the R9 because it makes a bit more peak horsepower, disregarding the fact that it features a larger, more modern engine, more electronics, a more updated and modern frame, and comes at a cheaper price too. Same thing with the Panigale V2. People are bemoaning the fact that it makes 35 less horsepower, completely forgetting the fact that it is a brand new motorcycle that is lighter, cheaper, and a little bit easier to ride. Look, we live in a world where you can, if you have the pocketbook, go to Ducati and pick up a 240 horsepower factory race bike that's pretty darn similar to what they use in World Superbike. 240 horsepower with a factory warranty. And on top of that, we have accessible, fun options that are great on track and great on street. If you ask me, I think we're living through the golden era of sport bikes. It just happens to be distributed unevenly. So yes, sport bikes in the 70s and 80s had crazy two-strokes and were raw and lightweight and analog. In the 80s and 90s, you had flashy paint schemes and cool twin round headlights and undertail exhaust, and the Ducati 916 was so amazing, and Honda was making V4 race bikes and everything was so great. But really, I think we are truly in one of the best times for sport bikes as long as you're willing to concede the fact that these practical, more road-oriented models are good for the industry. And if you want a crazy fast sport bike, they're still available. And honestly, if you don't want a crazy fast sport bike, you can get a crazy fast naked bike, a crazy fast adventure bike, a crazy fast cruiser. Literally any type of motorcycle you want can be crazy fast if you want it to be. And honestly, like I want to do here on Yami Noob, if you want to blame anything, blame the economy. Because I think if wages were to come up quite a bit, obviously we'd see sales of top shelf sport bikes go up. But unfortunately, that's just not the reality we live in. So boys, what do you think? Let me know down in the comments what you think about sport bikes then versus now. Are they too soft? Are they too nice? Do they not rev high enough for you? Or are you actually happy with the offerings we have and are excited that manufacturers are still making new stuff? They could just simply stop making sport bikes, but they still do. Hopefully there will be plenty of enthusiasts to keep the motives alive. It's a ton of fun to ride sport bikes on track and on road, and I personally will only stop when my back dictates me to stop. Thanks so much for checking out today's video. Be sure to check out the giveaway MT07 on yammynoob.co. That is a sweet sport bike and a nice upright configuration. That parallel twin is a gem. Plenty torquey and plenty fun. We'll catch you guys in the next one. See you later.